with Hannah when you were, what, 16?
16 and 20.
At the University of
Between the ages of 16 and 20, yeah.
One of the things that she wrote in, I think, On Revolution was she was a real supporter of the council system in the United States, in which communities would meet, like here, and the power in politics would come from the grassroots, from the people. And I want to encourage this to be a discussion with you all and these esteemed gentlemen here, because every day, I've been in politics for a long time. I covered a lot of politics in my career. 9/11, impeachments, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I also covered January 6th when that occurred. I remember watching it and thinking, what is happening here? And then it got worse and worse and worse. And it was then that I decided I had the question, what is going on in our country? And that's when I picked up something by Hannah Arendt to figure out what was going on. So one of the things that I've been reading about is Roger has been writing these essays. They come out on Sundays, I think, right? And you wrote an essay a couple of weeks ago, and then you built on it this week. But a couple of weeks ago it was called Crossing the Line. Because when we had this discussion in June, I think, at Bard in Brooklyn, I don't think you would have written the essay Crossing the Line then. Tell us what you mean about crossing the line, but then get into, if you can, what you mean about the underlying conditions that are happening in our country right now.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for making the movie, which is really a powerful movie, and I hope you guys, tell friends to see it. I think all of us, Hannah Arendt in the movie, and she's quoted as saying, what point did you become political, right? At what point, and she says it was, on February, the Reichstag fire was February 27th,
33.
33. And, I think a lot of us who are writing about the world and trying to understand the world today are wondering, if and when that line will be crossed, right? My friend George Packer had an article in The Atlantic this week, which I wrote about this Sunday, arguing that we now live in an authoritarian country. I don't agree with him. First of all, I don't like the word authoritarian. I think we should be talking about tyranny rather than authoritarianism. But, I think we are living in a country in which what we now see, and this is what I meant by crossing the line, is that the president has taken the gloves off and has made it very clear that he wants to be a tyrant. I don't think he's an ideological tyrant like Hitler was or Stalin was. I don't think he has a plan. I think he just wants to break down the system, and he wants to be in full control and have full power. And I, in that piece, went through a number of his recent events in which it was clear that he just doesn't see anything that can limit him, and he doesn't even hide it anymore, that what he wants is absolute control. But I don't think he has it yet, right? That's the distinction I would make from someone like George Packer. We don't yet live in a tyranny. We live in a country that clearly the person who's the president wants to become a tyrant, but we still have certain breaks that we can use. I'm not sure how long they'll last, but that was what I was writing about and trying to figure out where the line might be.
Leon, Hannah Arendt writes in Between Past and Future, she said, quote, "The ominous silence that still answers us whenever we dare to ask not what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for?" And I guess the question for you is, how do you see this moment? We all know what's happening if you read the newspapers and listen to all kinds of things. question for a lot of people, and Chana and I talk about this all the time, is what are we fighting for and how do we get involved politically?
Well, I'm not a politician, and by virtue of the position I hold, I'm obliged to be in the public eye in expressing opinions. I mean, I don't think you have to make a distinction between representing an institution and being an individual who has been given, for better or for worse, a position of responsibility in a place of learning and not speak out. So I have in recent weeks published and been on various news media in warning about the incredible danger of what's happening. So what we're fighting for, in my view, is a very simple freedom of speech and of academic freedom without fear. In other words, the big difference now is that even under Nixon, where there was an enemies list, and there was vague, ominous, they kept files on Martin Luther King and on Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, the FBI. But, you know, J. Edgar Hoover was scary, and certainly I wasn't old enough during the McCarthy years, which were very dangerous, because they created a climate of betrayal. People told on their neighbors. This is, for anybody who's lived through the Second World War, and certainly the communist system, this is a horrific, really destruction of the human community, where you betray your neighbors, where there's a premium, parents for their children, and stuff like that. So what we're fighting for is, I think, freedom of thought and expression without fear. And what this president has done is mobilize the power that Roger talks about in a way which creates incredible fear in the population, which leads to cowardice, self-censorship, and it interrupts the freedom of movement and speech, the fundamental freedom of being in a citizen in a community. Roger said something which I think is interesting. He is a petty tyrant. The good news is that he's not an ideological tyrant. He's a petty tyrant. One day he's against that group, then that group. He loves the arbitrariness of his power and his ability to manipulate it on a daily basis, and he's profoundly narcissistic. So he wants to be in the center of attention, and he doesn't really care. He has no sense of the consequences and no concern. He has no, so that's the good news, because, you know, there is no purpose other than himself. And so there is something, the other thing which is there are no ideals. The hypocrisy of this thing is so enormous that there is no Aryan religion that's going to replace Christianity. You know, that was an idea. I mean, they had it. Rosenberg had it, the Nazi ideologues had it. They didn't like the Christian churches because they were competitors. He's not constructing that. And so what we're fighting for is something that I think is a genuine democracy in which And the internet has made it hard, because I have to say, if you're in any semi-public position of any kind, it is unimaginable the amount of terror, hate, and vilification you are subject to. There's every reason for a rational person to keep their head down.
Yeah.
So what would Hannah have us do now?
What would
What would Hannah do? You know, neither of us are Hannah. Although he looks a little more like her.
Yeah.
Let me come to that. I mean, I think what Leon and I are both getting at is something important that I want to come at a different way, which is that there's an old communist saying, right, that you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, right? Namely that you need violence to sort of to bring about the revolution. Arendt was fond of citing that, but she also turned it around, and she said that for people like Stalin and Mao, they actually meant you can't break eggs without making an omelet. That often, at least for tyrants as opposed to ideological totalitarians, for tyrants, she said, the point is simply to break eggs. They don't know what they're trying to build. They don't have an ideological idea. They just want to break eggs and tear the system down so that they can create the kind of disorder and corruption that leads them to be able to have total power. And that's, I think, very much what's going on. So that when you ask, what can we do, right? You have to understand what's going on. Arendt saw that tyranny is not the same as totalitarianism. Tyranny is based, petty tyranny, as Leon says, is based in corruption. It's based in this idea that the argument is if we accept the $400 million jet, if we make $5 billion on cryptocurrency, if we put our enemies in jail, people are going to say, "Good for you." It shows that you're a realistic guy. That you figured out the world. It shows that being a little bit of a mafioso pays off, and it destroys the norms and the ideas of a legal, civilized society. And so I think the big question that I've been writing about, that Jeff talks about, is, there's sort of three options, right? One is you accept the Trumpian idea, and and by the way, it's not just Trump. I think the liberals, a lot of people on the left have been arguing this for a long time. But you accept the idea that there is no law. It's all a sham. And it's all about power. And you simply say win at any cost, and you fight to win because all you want is power. The other side is you have a kind of nostalgic, I want to go back to the law. I want to go back to liberalism. I want to go back to the institutions of impartiality and legality and truth. I'm not sure you can right now. I don't know. And then the third option is you figure out somehow a new idea that will be compelling, and that's very hard to do. And I think a lot of people are caught, but take the gerrymandering thing that's going on, right? One half says it's all about power, you can't bring a knife to a gunfight, you gotta do what they're doing and play by their rules, it's all about power. The other side says you gotta go back to ideals and try and create a neutral, fair system. And the truth is we're caught between these two divides. Neither one of them really is attractive or works, and people are struggling to find a new way forward.
So I agree with Roger that it's impossible to speculate what Arendt would have, how she might have reacted. But one thing I did share, I learned from her and shared, is that she had this very interesting theory that the cost of violence was not erasable. She had kind of a Lady Macbeth theory of violence, that a social revolution, a political revolution that sheds a lot of blood, like the Reign of Terror, for example, which is why she distinguished the American situation as being a war of independence. That somehow was a different animal, but the internal purging, let's say, of violent revolutions leaves a stain which is almost impossible. So you need to find a way to make the change without violence on one hand. The other thing is that the abuse of the law. The other thing that is very dangerous to me is that Trump does something which certain tyrannies and authoritarian regimes like the Nazis did, which is they manipulated the language of the law. He is, by corrupting the Justice Department, he makes the appeal to the law almost impossible. The third is something that Roger mentioned. This is where I'm optimistic. The president is completely corrupted by greed. He is the moral equivalent of Putin. Putin is among the richest people in the world. There is a kleptocracy afoot in Washington, which is very different from fanatical ideologues. You know, I don't know how rich Stalin was at the end of his life, but I doubt very rich.
Go ahead.
But there's a whole ideological operation.
Hold on a second, please.
You're going to be saying something that's exactly what I wanted to say.
On? Yes. There's an entire ideological operation at Trump's back.
Right. There. Ed, go ahead. You want to finish? Go.
Well, just basically that, so that he himself is completely self-interested and insane, yet he's being used, I guess.
Can I say I agree with you, except I would add an S to what you said. There are many ideological operations at his back, and they often disagree with each other. And Trump is the person who unifies them. And what's unifying them is not one of these ideologies, but it's, I think, this kind of kleptocracy and corruption. But you're right. Stephen Miller is one of the dangerous people. Lauren Loomer is another. But Voight and Musk are very different than Loomer and
I'm so sorry. So I covered Trump's first term, where you had people who were quote unquote the adults in the room, right? Esper, Secretary of Defense, Sessions, no matter what you thought about him, Attorney General, they were adherents to constitutional norms, if you will. Now you have, what did she say, fools who are just loyal and will do anything. What you saw happening with the firing of the Assistant Attorney General, or whatever he is, in Virginia, Bondi and her second in command did not want this guy fired. He was a good attorney. But Trump wanted him fired, and they acquiesced immediately. I believe, though, you have Russell Vought, who's one of the most dangerous people serving the president. He is a Christian nationalist, as is J.D. Vance. And even though Stephen Miller is Jewish, he's a Christian nationalist as far as I'm concerned. And that Vought wants to create a much more powerful executive branch, taking away power of the purse from Congress. And my concern and my question to you both is that in June when we talked, there were really no lines being crossed, right? Now we're in almost October. The National Guard is going to Portland. 3 people have been arrested, and I think they're going to be charged and trying to be sent away for 5 years. That Hannah Arendt talked about people should be politically involved, and she lauded the nonviolent movement. And the question for you both is, more lines will be crossed, are being crossed. And my question for everybody here is, what would you recommend people do?
So I may say, where I disagree about this is that I agree that there is no coherent white nativist nationalism has demographically very little chance to succeed in the long run. That kind of racism in this country will boomerang, but that's a different matter. The most important thing is that what needs to be done is actually to actually stand up and be counted and heard. I am amazed to see, I think the line was crossed a long time ago. And what bothers me is how little distress there is in the country about ISIS behavior. The people should be in the streets. There should be an interruption of normalcy, civil disobedience. There should be an outpouring of outrage on the part of the churches and the clergy. There is not a level of moral outrage. We have somehow not been able to galvanize the basic decency of our fellow citizen, and we, especially here in the East, have to learn how to talk to people who, for whatever reason, whether it's ignorance and naivete or passivity, think there's nothing to be terribly worried about. And I'm amazed by how far he's gotten without a public response, and that's because we don't have effective unions, they're gone, that there's no organizing of people actually to stop the trains from running on time in protest for what's happening. It's known as civil disobedience. And that's what has to happen. Ordinary citizens have to stop liking their comfort zone and say, this is not the country I want to be part of, and this is not the way it should be led. But without that, nothing will happen.
Want me to answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, I agree that, I mean, the most important thing is for people to not go along as if this is normal, right? The argument of the lesser evil, that I should still keep working for these organizations because, well, if other people work for them, it'll be worse. We have to give up on that. The lesser evil is still evil. And at some point, people have to withdraw. But I think, I mean, where I don't know if we all would agree with this or not, but I think the biggest problem we're having right now, I think most people, not most, I think a large majority of the country thinks what ICE is doing is wrong. The problem we have right now is that the Democrats or the opposition, or whatever you want to call it, is as unpopular or more unpopular than the president. And if they can't articulate this is when Jeff cited this line, we all know what we're arguing against, but we don't know what we're fighting for. A lot of us know we don't want tyranny, and we don't want totalitarianism, and we don't want ICE arresting our neighbors, right? I think that's pretty clear. Not everyone, but most of us. The problem is, you can't articulate a counter because, if you try and say, the Democrats are unable to say, well, we want to close the borders, or we want to, they haven't been able to because there's things they won't say. They don't speak honestly. They worry about how it's going to be read by their different constituencies. And we have a real crisis of leadership on the other side. And until someone emerges, I think it's going to be very hard to stop the president.
Where I disagree with Roger is I'm suspicious about crisis of leadership. There's a crisis of ideas. The one fundamental idea that will never sell in America, which is a tragedy, is a serious distribution of wealth. You cannot have a democracy with this level of the inequality of wealth in the United States. People talk about Harvard University as being a rich university. That's nonsense. Since 1636, it's accumulated an endowment of $54 billion, which is a fraction of the wealth of 12, 15, 20 people we can name in this room where that wealth was accumulated in less than a lifetime. Now that is not possible in a democracy. And things that reek of socialism, redistribution, wealth, have no resonance in the American public. It never did. And so you have a collapse. I don't envy the opposition, because what will help the crumbling infrastructure of the country? What will help this country be great and competitive? An investment in public works, in our airports, in our public transportation, in the climate. That's going to cost money. What's going to help alleviate poverty and illness? Money. Where's the money going to come from? The money can only come legally from taxation. And taxation of whom? Not working people in Red Hook.
I agree, Leon. The issue right now is that if you look at the Democratic Party, the part that's most exciting to many people, especially our students, right, are people like AOC and Bernie Sanders and the DSA left. The reason they can't move forward is, I think, not about that. I think they would have an enormous attraction to many of the working class people in this country, but they are unable to speak in ways about social issues, whether it's immigration or racism or trans issues that are appealing to the working class. And as a result, they don't seem honest, they seem corrupt, and people don't trust them.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, which is true, is that since Reagan, the thing that has disturbed me most as an observer is the erosion of trust in government and public service. Americans don't trust their government to deliver. They still think medicine is a consumer item.
Question?
I just want to ask you about, I sort of want to get to that question. The CIA, when they were trying to deal with Al-Qaeda in Guantanamo, their method was what they call learned helplessness, which is to block every avenue of agency. And so in our country, both parties have contributed to the learned helplessness of the population. Well, I mean, when you do polls, you find that 90% of people want Medicare for all, that 70% of people want to stop sending weapons to Israel, that a vast majority of people are in favor of canceling student debt. But whatever the politicians who say they are in favor of these things and get elected, they don't do them. So I think we have created a basis for this kind of learned helplessness. I can't tell you how many people have asked me, okay, well, I see what's going on, but what can I do?
So we're a little bit in the thrall of opinion polls, and I'm suspicious of those. I actually think we haven't been robbed of our agency. If we're willing to take the time to talk to the people who don't agree with us or haven't thought about it, we could win if we really organize and with respect and not contempt talk to people who have a completely different worldview, who are resistant to this, and you actually really organize. I think we could make progress, so I think we're not prisoners, not yet.
I think one thing that hasn't been talked about, and I think it's of importance to talk about, is SCOTUS and what is going on in the Supreme Court. He has had 20 emergency executive orders in front of them, and they pretty much have cited for all of them. They've given him unlimited access to everything. They haven't stopped him. He is now asking to speed up, talking about birthright citizenship. I think that's something that in some of these other countries, during the times of the 40s and 50s and the rise of Hitler, didn't have to deal with courts. But we do. We have an appellate court and Fifth Circuit, they have saved us several times just to get over to the Roberts Court and get overturned.
So, I think it's a good point, and I think it's what a lot of people ask about.
It's exhausted.
I think one thing to say is that the Constitution didn't imagine the Supreme Court as the great savior against presidential power. They saw the Congress and the states as the savior against presidential power. And one of the problems we have today is because, so I agree with Leon that we have more power than we think we do. But I see it a little differently, I think, in that I think that over the last 70 to 80 years, we have been trained and we haven't willingly given up a lot of our power to courts and bureaucracies. Hannah Arendt wrote late in the 1960s that the greatest danger to American freedom was the rise of bureaucracy and big government. And I think that we do have the ability to act, but we have to take it, and that's probably going to happen more at a local and state level. As much as I hate Russell Boyd, and people already mentioned him, if it were just him, the freedom would not be the issue, because we'd be back at the states, and there'd be ways to reimagine local power and local freedom. It's the combination of him with corruption, with a big government and executive power that is dangerous. Anyway, I agree with you that the court is not going to save us. I think we should stop asking the court to save us, although it's a good break in the midterm, and we should start acting. We should start organizing. We should start organizing and organizing politically. That's, I think, unfortunately, the answer. That's how this country works. It's a democracy.
Is there a concern that there's already sort of an infrastructure in place, whether that's gerrymandering or whatever, maybe something we don't know about already, that all of this doesn't matter?
He's asking if
I go want to see where you are. Go ahead.
he wants to know if the fix is in, if it's all going to be, if we don't have that's what you're asking, right? If he's going to stay on for a third term and we don't have a choice in the matter.
He, first of all, time is on our side. He's not a young man. So there's always a probability that that biology will be destiny, and that he may not be able, even if he had thought about it. I also think that there is an anarchism in American culture and life, which is peculiar. There is finally an end point of a resistance to authority. There's a voluntary conformism as opposed to a desire to conform to authority. In other words, Americans are very conformist, but they think they've done it themselves. Whereas the more traditional forms of conformity are in response to fear and centralized power. So I think there is a breaking point even in the right, and the Epstein cases point that out. And there was this article in today's Times, which I could barely read, about Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yes.
That was really a spellbinder, that one. Because suddenly she's some kind of heroine, Joan of Arc, but it's quite clear that, in post to your comment, which is perfectly rational comment, I don't see these acolytes, Steve Miller. They may be devilish in their thoughts, but they have no capacity to communicate to the public, which is what the monopoly he possesses. So I think the fix is not in. Now, there are people who believe there will be no midterm elections. Now, is such a scenario possible? Yes. So if you take the Charlie Kirk assassination killing as a rehearsal, right? You know, is there a possibility? You know, I watched recently in a sleepless night, what was that movie, 7 Days in May? You remember this movie? How many are old enough to know such a movie existed? Yeah. Have you ever seen this?
No.
Oh, it's fantastic. Burt Lancaster is in it, and it's about a president. It's communist times, and there's a coup, a military coup against the president. It's all organized and very, and you know, it was hard to watch for this reason. But I do think that I think that maybe I'm a naive optimist. I don't think that will happen. In part because it will endanger the great life that the president has already. In other words, it's too much trouble. That's the advantage of being a petty tyrant as opposed to an ideological one.
No, I wanted to also shift to a subject in the film in which these two gentlemen don't necessarily see eye to eye, if I could. But I want to, you have questions, we're on a roll here. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask a question about Hannah in the last part. She had an unfinished piece of work.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, do you know whose hands those are in? Is there a chance someone, oh, it's
It's finished.
It is?
I mean, Mary McCarthy took it. Go ahead, Roger.
Well, I mean, The Life of the Mind was supposed to be 3 parts, thinking, willing, and judging. The thinking part was pretty much done and to some degree edited by her. The willing part was, a draft was done, and the judging part had not been written, although she had given a series of lectures on it. Mary McCarthy, her first executor, edited the thinking and willing part and published them as the book Life of the Mind. Not the full book, but the first 2 parts. A new version of it, edited by 2 of our colleagues here at Bard, has just come out that restores the original before Mary McCarthy's edits of that, which has been published in the Gesamtausgabe, the collected works of Hannah Arendt. I just taught a 6-month lecture course on that book online that you can find either on podcast or on YouTube if you're interested. But yeah, it's been published and it's there.
That's the thinking part.
Thinking and willing.
Thinking and willing. So I had lunch with her about 2 weeks before she died, and the reason is she was beginning to think about working on judgment, and so it was modeled after the 3 critiques of Kant: pure reason, practical reason, and critique of judgment. And her husband, Heinrich Bücher, his primary nominal field of expertise was aesthetics. And in our library and archive are his lectures on aesthetics. Now, aesthetics is a central portion of the judgment. And she knew that I was interested in the philosophy of music, the philosophy of art. So she asked me whether I would read Heinrich's stuff that I never knew existed. I never met him, so which was in the library here, and then talk to me about it. So, because her question was, can she build on that and build that out to be the judgment, core of the judgment part, or she has to write it herself? So when I had lunch with her, I said, in my humble opinion, this is useless. You have to start from scratch. You know, this is, forget about this. It's not really to be taken seriously. And my impression, again, from having been her student too, is that although the new edition is a great improvement of the old, it's not finished Arendt. It reminds me of the Mahler 10th Symphony. I mean, don't, if you want to know what Hannah Arendt thinks, this is a very interesting text, even in Mary McCarthy's version of it, but it does not hold a candle to the stuff that she poured over and constantly revised, and that she was very particular about what she let go into publication. So I would be cautious. I think it's great for them to do it, but the real meat of Hannah Arendt is in the published work that she saw through publication.
You know, one of the things I just wanted to bring out, we have some students here, right? And we've been talking about how to get politically active. We did have a scene in the film that we cut out because we had to whittle this down from 2 hours to 84 minutes or something like that. But that scene includes this guy who, as a student, participated in a sit-in at the University of Chicago. He was active in the civil disobedience movement, and Hannah Arendt went to see him and others. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we invited her, but this is so arcane, it's so naive, it's so frighteningly leads us to nostalgia. What were we protesting in 1964? The cooperation between the university and the selective service. In other words, what the selective service did, it gave deferment to college students. But if you did poorly in college, you could lose your deferment. On the bizarre theory that the better student had less of a reason to die in battle. It's a completely ethically impossible idea that a university should cooperate with the selective service of sending which young people go and risk their lives for their country. So we protested the collaboration between the university and the essentially military establishment, right? She thought that was a great cause. So we invited her to come visit. And she and the classes at James Redfield, they showed up, and she sat down on the floor. I was somewhere here, but interestingly, her German emigre colleagues were severely critical of her. So I went for a tutorial with Christian Machar, who was a classicist from Germany, anti-fascist. And he said, "You're wrong. I know you think well of her, but the fact is, you and the other students who are protesting and occupying the building, they remind me of the Nazi youth movements in the university, which took over buildings. They remind me of the other side. Just remember that," and that has always rung in my ears.
So, with that in mind, what would you advise your students here in terms of getting involved politically?
And the most important thing I would advise, of course, is self-serving, is we are not agents of the government. So protesting the institution of learning, unless it's a university that is in collusion, as the University of Chicago was with the selective service, go to Washington, to New York, to the places where politics is conducted. It's so convenient, you know. Only the arrogance of Ivy League students can believe that erecting tents in front of Butler Library is going to end the war in Gaza. The war in Gaza is not decided on the lawn of Columbia University or the lawn of Harvard University or the lawn of any of these universities.
Well, we could go into that. That did create quite an issue about free speech and basically kidnapping people off the streets without due process, and you know. But I wanted to bring something else up, which is about Martin Heidegger, because that man over there, I think, Roger, you did, I think, a doctoral dissertation on Heidegger, or?
No, but I did spend 15 of the first years of my academic life reading closely and working on Martin Heidegger, yes.
So before we get to Roger's response, in the film, you said, I mean, people are asking, how could Hannah Arendt in 1949, 1950, after going through what she went through
And this guy, as you said, and later on there were these black books that really reveals that this guy was a Nazi. Yeah, terrible. Terrible not to pick up the microphone, you should say that. But she went back to him because...
So this is the Australian Arendt thought in which the private and the political don't mix. So she and Heidegger had what can only be described, for both of them I think, a life-changing love affair when she was a student of his. And this is before he was a Nazi, where it involved poetry, sex, who knows what, and it was intense, and I think that no experience subsequent in her life of an intimate nature ever matched that memory and reality. And she had a loyalty, kind of ethics of loyalty to friendship and to particularly intimacy that that transcended. And I'm not wildly critical of it. It's completely humanly understandable. And in 1949, frankly, Heidegger cut a pathetic figure. Now he recovered later a little bit, but you know, I'm not a person of revenge. I abhor violence. I believe in forgiveness. I had a grandfather who survived ghetto and camp, and I remember as a boy watching him write a brief on behalf of one of the SS guards, right, who was standing trial for his life, writing a brief for clemency, for leniency. It made an enormous impression on me. You know, so I don't understand the ease with which people criticize her for holding on to what must have been one of the most inspiring and transformative personal relationships of her entire life. And in her private life, I only feel sorry for Gunther Stern, who was a very smart guy. Gunther Anders, a very smart man to the end of his days, and wrote very interesting things. He gets hammered in all these Hannah Arendt, I don't know why. But so I nothing good to say about Heidegger as a political figure, and what I do understand of his philosophy, which is courtesy of other people describing it to me as opposed to understanding what he has to say. You know, I have no cause of fall. How these friends, this is true, we had a colleague, David Kepler, who died the last couple of years, wonderful political theorist, a German Jewish emigre. He had a project at the end of his life of first letters. He investigated how did the emigres and the Nazis that survived pick up friendships that had ended in 1933. It was a project called First Letters. And I remember vividly Bruno Walter and Hans Pfitzner, the composer, was an ardent Nazi, and Bruno Walter, a Jew, was Mahler's assistant. And Pfitzner writes him as if nothing has happened. How are you? Blah, blah, blah. There's nothing happened. And Walter thinks, what is he going to answer this guy? But interestingly, each of these people finds a way back. And none of them had the kind of intense relationship that Hannah Arendt had with Heidegger. She was already traumatized by this when she went to study with Jaspers. You know, she was working out the consequences of this relationship for the rest of her life. And she owed, remember, she owed two debts intellectually, one to Heidegger and the other to Jaspers. Because the Eichmann book, for example, the banality would never have been possible without the question of German guilt, which Jaspers wrote in 46. So she was very loyal to her teachers.
So, first of all, I agree with Leon that that Heidegger was one of, if not the love, one of the two loves of Arendt's life. And I also agree that friendship is central to her thinking about the world. I actually just handed today in a new book, manuscript on friendship called A World We Share, about the power of friendship in a broken world. And it's my reading of Arendt on friendship. So I share Leon's view on those matters. All I will say is that Arendt, I wrote the chapter in the first Letters project that our colleague David Kettler organized on her letters back, on Arendt's letters back to Heidegger and Jaspers. And so it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. Arendt thought long and hard about whether she would see Heidegger again. She didn't write him a letter in 1945 like she did to Jaspers. She didn't see him until she was in Freiburg and was debating whether to see him or not. And she didn't know what she would think. What she has said, though, is that there were certain people who coordinated. The word in German is Gleichschaltung. It's this idea of coordinating with the authorities, and who coordinated with the Nazis, that she could never speak to again. One Leon actually spoke about at our conference 2 years ago, Benno von Wiese, who she just thought was a terrible Nazi and she could never talk to again. But she said there were other people who coordinated for a certain amount of time, and they weren't murderers. So in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she has this line where she says there's an abyss between people with fantastical ideas and people who do horrific and terrible and brutal deeds. She met Heidegger again in 1950, talked to him, and they talked in that first meeting about forgiveness, revenge, and reconciliation. Exactly this question of whether she should forgive him, whether she should be angry about him in vengeance, or what this third way is. And she chose reconciliation. And I've written a number of books and articles on this topic. It's sort of become one of my ideas. But what she came to believe about Heidegger is that he made a mistake. She doesn't think he was, and I mean, again, it depends what you mean by an ideological Nazi. He joined the Nazi party, but after 11 months, he was, in a sense, removed. And he was under house arrest for most of the war by the Nazis because he was seen as unreliable. He never embraced a biologic racism. He never embraced that kind of idea. You know, he did have this idea that he expressed in 1933 in a speech, what's called the Rektorsrede, the address he gave when he was made rector in Freiburg, in which he talked about the need for the German university to assume its historical destiny. But for him, that was never racial, and he was seen as unreliable and proved unreliable. And I think what Arendt came to believe, now whether it was self-serving or not, was that he made a mistake. He was a liar. She thought he was always a liar. He lied to himself. He lied to others. But she doesn't think he was an ideological Nazi. He doesn't think he was a racist, and she certainly didn't think he wanted people killed. And she makes a distinction, and I think that distinction is important. I'm not saying we should all like Heidegger, personally, but I think his philosophy, I mean, I think his philosophy is profound and inspirational, and I don't think he's the kind of person that is so awful as a human being. I think he's a bad human being, but he's not so awful that one has to abandon his work and himself. And I think that's what she came to believe, that the world was better with him and his ideas in it than with him and his ideas out of it.
So my disagreement with Roger is slight. I don't share the more rosy picture of Heidegger and the firing of Husserl. I don't find it, and all the new material that's come out makes him more of an ideologue than you suggest. But I do understand that the haze of her memory and her own biography made it impossible to see it that clearly. And I forgive her that. I don't hold that against her. I don't look at my loved ones clearly either. Do any of us look at our loved ones and believe it? And there's no, you can't get around it. Or my parents. So that's the situation we're in. And I think Jaspers understood it. I don't think he was entirely thrilled with the whole thing, but so we don't disagree. I would love once to learn more about why Heidegger is so transcendently important.
That'll be the next discussion.
Well, we do have, can we have time for one more?
Yeah, go ahead. One more.
Hillary, do we have a mic over
And then
here?
we'll wrap it up.
Dimitri?
Thank you. I have a question to Professor Botstein. I was wondering about your experience in classroom with Hannah Arendt, and especially how it contrasts with what we have nowadays in our similar style classes, for example, in Weis. And in particular, I was thinking, do you think any of her theory on atomization and the importance of human connection informed the way she kind of modeled the classroom, or maybe modeled the personal relationship with students? Like, did any of that convert into who she was as a professor?
It's a very good question. She was a talker, which meant in the seminars where she talked, in a tutorial, she would ask you one-to-one what you think. That was she was interested, she was curious. But most of the time, you were listening to her, and what she was like, and what you learned from her is that you cannot think silently. She thought by talking. In other words, one of the terrible things about all the cancel culture that we've lived through is that people will take what you say out of context, because the moment it comes out of your mouth, it becomes transformed. And it is an inhibition to thinking by talking. People say, and she would try things out, in speculative ways, and let it bounce off people's reaction. In other words, as opposed to declaring the truth. That's why politicians are so boring, because there is no improvisation, no speculation. And she had an unbelievable capacity for spontaneous interpretation. If you said something, and she would, like a riff in a jazz, it would pick up the tune and she would elaborate it. So that's what you learned in the class. The other thing is that, and this is a key to teaching, she took you seriously no matter how stupid you were. That was an amazing gift. She never said, "You idiot," or anything like that. No. So if someone in the class would say something and you would think, well, she, with a straight face, she took it seriously. She made, what is it, you can't make a sow's, what's sow's purse? This English friend? A sow's ear, what is it called?
Something like that.
Something like that. But no, she was able to do that. That is to say, she communicated to students an inherent respect for their equality. They were colleagues, not underlings.
Okay.
Thank you.